Hi, Professor Wills here. So we are in the early 20th century in our modern art class, and in this mini video lecture, we're going to look at early 20th century American photography. We are going to focus on some photographers who began in New York City, one of whom, by the name of Alfred Stieglitz, would be very impactful, not only through the approach to photography that he takes, but also because of this gallery that he opens in New York City, becoming a really important artery for modern art. We've already met the Armory show and how impactful that was to audiences in places like New York City, Boston, and elsewhere, but as well as the Ashcan School and the Eight. But in these early days, Alfred Stieglitz and his gallery were also very important in terms of ushering in a modern art era finally in the United States. So without further ado, let's get into Alfred Stieglitz and meet a couple of additional photographers who were important to the story of American early modern photography, one of whom you may already know, famous name and a famous California native son. All right, let's pivot to that PowerPoint. All right, very good. Here we go. Align the viewing window here for you. On the left is a photograph by Alfred Stieglitz called The Steerage from 1907. So Stieglitz was a respected photographer who worked hard to elevate photography to fine art. Photographers at this point were often struggling against those who saw the camera and photography as something merely as a technical device to assist other endeavors, and not it wasn't given the appreciation it deserved in the eyes of many audiences to the level of fine art. But Stieglitz endeavored to take it to that level. He's also known as an advocate for something called straight photography, meaning that there was no additional manipulation of the photograph in the darkroom, as we've met with some of the surrealist photographers who would play with the exposure time, manipulate objects on light-sensitive paper, do double exposures, that kind of artistic manipulation. This was a totally different approach. And we can see it in the example on the left called The Steerage from 1907. It's his most famous photograph, and one that he took rather spontaneously. In these days, of course, the main transportation to get across the Atlantic to Europe was to ride one of these large steamships. And it's there that he just observed something that captured his eye. And I know many of us are sort of thinking already ahead of what I'm about to say. We think the movie Titanic, we think about the many works of art in this class that talks about or focuses on social and economic disparity between rich and poor, the idea of the struggling, the immigrant communities riding below deck and the privileged people riding above deck. Well, this was not the case. In this instance, Stieglitz was seemingly after pure aesthetics. He saw this scene, liked the groupings top and bottom of the people, appreciated compositionally the rich tonality between lights and darks, the interesting intersection of horizontals and verticals. There's even interesting diagonal lines intersecting the composition. And one could argue there's a play of curves here in the railing of the gangplank. So all of that it creates this pleasing aesthetic composition that attracted him. And it was such a perfect marriage of forms, diagonals, contrasts of lights and darks, that he took the photo. It was just a straight up a scene that didn't require any previous manipulation, any staging. That's the nature of straight photography without subtext, as he explained, a study in mathematical lines in a pattern of light and shade. Stieglitz was known for hosting the most avant-garde exhibitions of art from European artists, photographers, as well as African art at his 291 gallery, which ran from 1905 to 1917 in New York City. He also frequently visited Europe, traveling to Berlin, Paris, and elsewhere, and that allowed him to really have his finger on the pulse of modernism as it was unfolding. He then began to host progressive American artists in his gallery, providing a space for the pioneers of American modernism. All right, two of which we'll meet today. And so he not only hosted painters and other artists in more traditional fine art techniques, but also emerging photographers. Paul Strand was one of them. This is his photograph, Rancho de Taos Church, New Mexico, taken in 1931. As a photographer himself, it's not a surprise that Stieglitz exhibited photography at his 291 gallery, and it's there that photographers like Paul Strand found support. Strand was both a photographer and a filmmaker who worked in New York City, even working with Louis Hine, whom we've met. He was once known for a more artistic pictorial style, but then he discovered Cubism. And with the support and encouragement of Stieglitz, was also drawn to straight photography without all of that manipulation practiced by others. A common trend in the 1930s was for artists to travel and live in the American Southwest in artistic colonies. And that is what Taos, New Mexico was famous for. So it's not surprising to see this image of Rancho de Taos Church in New Mexico, a beloved structure known to many at that time, and see Paul Strand's influences play out in this photograph. What you see here is a pretty compressed view up close. It's not pulled back, for instance, where we have a deep landscape surround. There's a bit of sky, there's a bit of earth, but with this brilliant, perhaps late afternoon lighting, you can see the play of light and shadow on that adobe structure and how much it brings out the forms and shapes of it, much like a Cubist painting. And of course, without much manipulation, just a straight up photograph in that spirit of straight photography. Let's meet our next photographer. All right, this is the work of Ansel Adams. Ansel Adams and his work is probably something you are already familiar with. There is an abundance of merch or merchandise of Ansel Adams' work in malls and shopping centers across the country. When you go hunt for that, greeting card or picking up a wall calendar or daily planner, you may find that the work, the landscape photography of Ansel Adams is showcased on it. He's probably the most reproduced photographer of all time. And we can definitely call him a native son to California. As a teenager, he is known to hike in our beautiful Sierra Nevada mountain ranges, visiting Yosemite and places like it that, of course, are part of the amazing national parks of the state. But he did spend some time in New York City. And it's there that Paul Strand encouraged him to pursue photography. And Of course, encountering Alfred Stieglitz, who supported Adams in his work by exhibiting his work at the 291 Gallery. Like Paul Strand, Adams often went for the close-ups. Here you can see in this image taken during winter, the contrasts and textures are rich between the forest, the rocks, the water, the snow. In this instance, it's a kind of reduction to form and texture that one can almost read as a purely abstract composition if you didn't read the title of the photograph. All right, so these are 3 examples of important photographers in early 20th century American photography that really were impactful in bringing a more modern American aesthetic to that technique. Thanks for joining me.